Hey everybody, I am Tucker and I am an intern here at The Way. If you don't know me, it's probably because I get to oversee our young adults group, which is made up of our 22 and up, and so I get to hang out with all the people who have come through The Way and graduated from Tech, or people who have come for master's programs at Tech, and I get to spend time with the people who stick around here. So this morning we are going to be this evening, I know what time it is, I promise. This evening we're going to be in Philippians 3, but before I start to read through that, I'd like to share with you guys just a little bit about me. If you haven't heard some of my testimony, hopefully this will be a good time to hear some of that. I'm currently out at Wayland. They have a Lubbock campus here, but I'm currently working on getting my Bachelor of Christian Ministry because I want to do vocational ministry, and I think that's something that the Lord has called me to. Actually, the job that I have here at the church as an intern with the young adults, that's what I want to do with the rest of my life. I think that's what the Lord is calling me to, but it has not always been the case. For a long time, actually, I didn't care about God or what He had for me. When I first was trying to decide what I was called to do or what I wanted to do really with my life, I decided, you know what, I think I can do engineering. My dad was an engineer. I knew that I wanted to make a lot of money, that I wanted to be successful, that I wanted to make my dad proud. And even though I actually had some friends and my youth minister both, they told me, man, I think that you should really consider going into ministry. I was like, that sounds nice, but I think I'm going to stick with the money. I think I'm going to stick with the engineering degree. And unfortunately, that didn't really pay off for me. I actually spent 3 years trying to be an engineer at Tech. I went to college. I knew Christ. I was saved when I was 6. So I knew Christ going into college, but the way I was living, I didn't care about Him. I didn't want anything to do with Him, really. I tried to attend church every once in a while. I was a part of a Christian fraternity. But the truth is He was nowhere near being a priority for me. And so 3 years into my degree at Tech, I actually failed out of Tech. I was miserable. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I had put everything into being an engineer. That was the most important thing to me. And when that didn't pan out, I didn't know what else to do. I had no backup plan. And so the only thing I could think of was I guess I could take some classes and maybe out at South Plains, which is a community college in Levelland, maybe if I can get back into Tech and pursue that degree, my plans will come back online and everything will work out in the end. And that was all I could think of. God, thankfully, had other plans for me, and during that time, He plugged me in, actually here at The Way, in a community group with some people who loved Jesus and knew Him, and in being able to spend time with them through the whole year I was actually out at South Plains, I was able to see these people walk with Christ and talk about Christ in a way that I had never experienced before. They talked about Him like they knew Him, like they were in a relationship with Him, like they walked and talked with Him. And that was something I had heard mentioned at church before. That was a concept that I had heard of, but I had never seen it put into action this way. It was something that I just did not understand. And God used that year, while I thought I was going to be going back to Tech, He used that year to completely sweep out some of the foundations that I had built my life on and my plans on. He slowly crumbled them and began to show me that His plan was better, and I eventually settled into trusting in Him and moving into a call to do ministry, which was not an easy thing, but it has already been so amazing. And I say that not to knock engineering. Engineering is a fantastic degree plan. If you're an engineer, don't stop being an engineer just because of this. That was me resisting my call. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what's going on with you. But as we talk through this passage tonight, I would try to encourage you to maybe think about why you're doing the things that you're doing, and make sure that it's not about building yourself up, that it's not about focusing on your success, but more that you are worried about or focused on knowing Christ, that you are focused on that relationship and the things that He has to offer you in that. And that's whether you have a relationship with Him already or not. I promise you that He has something to offer you. And so as we dive into this passage tonight, I just pray that you would focus on that. So like I said, we're going to be in Philippians chapter 3, and we're going to be reading verses 5 through 10. And so if you will, please read with me. Starting in verse 5, circumcised the 8th day of the nation of Israel of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, regarding the law of Pharisee, regarding zeal, persecuting the church, regarding the righteousness that is in the law, blameless. But everything that was a gain to me, I have considered to be a loss because of Christ. More than that, I also consider everything to be a loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. Because of him, I have suffered the loss of all things and consider them as dung, so that I may gain Christ and be found in him. Not having a righteousness of my own from the law, but one that is through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God based on faith. My goal is to know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. So tonight, like I said, we are going to be focusing on talking about knowing God. But before we really sink into the passage itself, I want to talk a little bit about that idea of knowing God. I think it's important to understand what Paul, the author of this, means by knowing Christ. And I touched on it a little bit, but he's not just talking about being saved, and he's not just talking about being a Christian. I think that and I know that what he is talking about, it points to a deeper picture of what it means to be a Christian. It's not just being saved, it is walking in a relationship with Christ. It's not just a box that we get to check off and say, I know Jesus and I have prayed that prayer. And it's not just studying the Word either. It's not about having the proper theology or the proper doctrine. It is all about that relationship with Christ. And I think a lot of times we can fall off the path because I've done that. I've fallen off on both sides of that by thinking either I'm saved and so I'm good. I don't have to worry about anything else. I've done all I needed to do. Or by thinking that, no, to be saved, I need to know all of the right stuff, or I need to do all of the right stuff. I need to perform well in order to be saved. And both of those they're not what God is actually concerned about. In reality, what he wants from us, it's a relationship. He wants us to know him, not just know about him, but to truly know him. Being saved is good and it's sufficient once you're saved. We believe that you are saved, that you cannot lose that salvation. And it is important to study the Bible. You should definitely study the Bible. If you're not already, dive into that. That is one way that we do get to grow in our relationship with him. But it's not the only thing when it comes to that relationship. Being concerned with theology and church doctrine, it's important. All of those things are good things. Being saved, studying the Word, knowing theology, those are good things. But I think what really matters, what God really wants us to know, is that even if we understand all of the Bible, even if we have the entire Bible memorized, it's not what he's calling us to. That's not everything. In Matthew 7, verse 23, Jesus talks about how there will be people who will come to the gates of heaven who will say, Lord, Lord, didn't we cast out demons in your name? Didn't we perform works? And Christ will say, I never knew you. Depart from me. And it's because those people, they missed the relational aspect. They understood some amazing things. They were casting out demons. They understood the power and authority of Jesus' name, but they completely dismissed the relational aspect, so much so that Jesus said, I never knew you. And if you have prayed that salvation prayer, if you do know Christ, if you have started that relationship, I just want you to know, if you haven't taken steps further into that relationship, you are missing out on so much of what being a Christian means and so much of what Christ has to offer you. So when we talk about knowing Christ tonight, and I'm going to say that hopefully a lot, I just want you to immediately think relationship. When I say know Christ, think relationship with Christ. To know Christ is to have that relationship with him, to be in a relationship with him. So keeping that on our minds as we work through, the first point for tonight is knowing the worth. I want to talk about the worth of knowing Christ, the worth of that relationship. And we're going to look in verse 7 and see what Paul says. He says, everything that was a gain to me I've considered to be a loss because of Christ. So if we look at Paul's background, especially if we were a part of the culture at that time, everything that he lists off in verses 5 through 6, talking about being circumcised, of the nation of Israel, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, a Pharisee, all of those things are really, really impressive, or they would be to us if we were there. One of the things that the guys that I got to study with this said is that, he was a Jewish celebrity. He is somebody that everybody would have recognized when he walked in. They would have been like, oh, that's so-and-so, maybe I should get his autograph. They would know who Paul was. All of those things were impressive. And Paul is actually, what he's doing here is saying, I am the man. I had everything I wanted. But when he compares that to the worth of knowing Christ, he says, it was all a loss. That he counts all of those things as a loss, the reputation, the success, his accomplishments as a righteous Pharisee, everything that he had a right to be proud of, he counts all of those things as a loss. In fact, he goes on to say that everything in his life, not just the positive things, but everything in his life was a loss compared to Christ. And what he means by that, what he means by loss, it actually means that they were worth less than worthless. That those things weren't just zero, but they were actually negative. That Christ he wasn't just more important than them, but he actually was so much more important that he made all of those things seem detrimental in comparison. That they, because they took up space in his life, that because they filled him up, they took away from what he could be experiencing with Christ. They took away space that he could give over to Christ, or they were actually pulling him away from knowing him. So why we see, I think, in that exactly what it's worth to Paul. Paul says it's worth everything. But why? Why is it worth so much to Paul? Like, why is that relationship with Christ worth so much to Paul? And I'm not going to dive too deeply into this because, honestly, there is so much there. Christ's worth, like, there's a reason that Paul expresses how strongly it is, how much it's worth to him. It's because there is so much there. And so the truth is there are a lot of reasons and things that make up the worth of Christ. So many reasons that he is good and that having a relationship with him is good. We know that we are set free from our sins, that he breaks those chains. We know that when we die, once we have that relationship with him, we actually get to spend eternity with him. And we know that there are a ton of other blessings that he pours out on our lives. Not that everything is perfect, but we know that there are good things and that Christ is worth so much. But how do we begin to transition into understanding that? Not just having like a biblical knowledge of, like Paul says, Christ is worth a lot of things, and we know that he will save us. Like those are good things. But how do we transition into caring about that? How do we transition into valuing that ourselves? I think it's an experiential thing. I think that when we actually experience Christ, when we actually walk with him in that relationship, that's when we begin to understand exactly how Paul felt. We start to actually know Christ and not just about him, and that's when this all starts to make sense. When we understand that our security, our well-being, our plans for the future, and even our sin, all of those things are in our hands. And when we begin to know that he is a loving and gracious Savior who died on a cross for us, but not just because the pastor told us he did, but when we know because we've walked through that with him, that is when we begin to understand the worth. And when we begin to see how amazing all of that stuff, everything that he is offering us is, then everything else begins to lose the worth that we once placed on it. Just like it did for Paul. Not necessarily because those things lose their worth, not because they become worth less, but because when we see them in the light of how much Christ is worth, when we compare those things to Christ, we see that he is worth so much more. There is a word there, actually, Paul, whenever he says surpassing, in the Greek, that word is actually hyperikon. And what it literally translates to is incomparable. And what Paul is saying is that not only is Christ of surpassing value, not only is he of worth so much more value, but that nothing else compares. It's you can't compare them. It's like, we say apples and oranges, like it's two completely different things. And so I want to take that and ask, what about you? What are the things that you would count as gain? What in your life would you say makes you a success? What is it that you value? Is it being in college? Or for most of us who went to tech, most of you who I think are in tech, is it because you made it to the college that you chose? Or is it more like for me because you are in the career field that you think like you will find success and worth in? Is it your grades? That wasn't it for me. That's why I fell out of tech. But maybe that's it for you. Like, is that what you find that value in? Is that what you count as a gain? Maybe it's not anything like that. Maybe it's having the right relationship with the right person. Maybe you see, man, like that is a gain to me. That gives me value, or that gives me worth. Maybe it's having the right kind of look or having the right kind of reputation. And none of these things are bad things. Those are all good things. You should have good grades. You should go to tech. That's a great school. Just because I failed out doesn't mean anything against tech. But just because those aren't bad things doesn't mean that they're worth holding on to when it comes to Christ. Christ is worth more than those things are. For me, I valued all of those things more than Christ. before and honestly even after knowing Christ, after I began that relationship, like I said, that started when I was young. Man, I still cared so much more about being successful, about making my parents proud, about having people think highly of me, about being strong on my own independent foundations. And if you had asked me if I cared about all those things, I would have said no. I would have said, oh yeah, I grew up in church. I know Jesus is the answer to everything. That's not what I live for. But the truth is, and when I shared this with one of the guys who was working through me, he was like, man, that's a lie. We lie to ourselves. There are things apart from Christ that we are living for. And so I would just have you ask yourself, maybe what are some of those things? What are some of those things that are in my life that maybe not at first glance, maybe I wouldn't own up to it, but if I really look deep, what are some of those things that maybe I'm living for apart from Christ? But more than that, actually, there are things that they are just filling our lives with clutter. There are little things that are not, big, lofty, this is the purpose of my life. They are not things that necessarily pull us directly away from Christ. Little things that just fill in the gaps, that take up our time. They make it so that we don't have room in our lives for Christ. Things like Netflix and video games. Maybe you don't have Netflix and maybe you're not into video games, but there's Hulu, there's Amazon Prime. Maybe you're into reading. That was one of the ones that I really tend to fill my life with and stuff. But because I wrote because I'm a very spiritual person and I like to do spiritual things. And I just want y'all to know, I want to say that sarcastically, but I don't know how to do that well from a stage. And so just know that I don't mean that. I know that is not the case, but kind of on a whim, me and a friend of mine, one of the guys that a lot of people know here, Warren, we were talking over the summer once quarantine hit and we realized that, man, I'm not going to be surrounded by my community in the same way for the rest of the semester. Both of us began to play video games a whole lot. And we were talking about how, I've actually wasted so much time over these last few weeks. And it's really kind of sad because even though I don't have my community and stuff, I have all of this free time that I could be spending with Christ, that I could be reading the Bible, that I could be praying. There are so many things, I could be using this time for, but instead I wasted, honestly, an embarrassing amount of time playing video games, as Elizabeth can attest to. Not good. And so we decided what we would do is, let's just give up all forms of entertainment for just a couple of weeks. We're going to try and get our minds right. We're going to stop, filling it with all of these things that really don't matter that much. And so I decided, okay, I'm not going to stream any TV. I'm not going to stream movies or anything like that. I'm not going to play any video games. I'm not going to listen to secular music. I was like, I'll take it a step up. I'm not going to listen to secular music. I'm not going to listen to any podcast. And you know what? I don't even like social media, but I'm not going to do anything on that either. So I was just anything that I could waste my time on, I'm going to try and get rid of that. And I did that thinking that, man, honestly, there are a lot of other things in my life that, I can distract myself with. I have a job, I have friends and people that I like to spend time with. So even though this isn't going to be a ton of fun, this won't be that hard. And when I told Travis about this, I said, Jesus, he saw me coming. He knew that I had some backup plans and some other stuff that I was well, if I get bored with Jesus, I can do these other things. What happened was actually the day after we had started the fast, my sister came into contact with somebody who tested positive for COVID. And so we all got quarantined at home for 2 weeks. And I didn't have Netflix, and I didn't have video games, and I didn't have music. And at first, I was kind of frustrated, but because I'm stubborn, I was like, no, I already committed to this. I'll do it. I won't do any of that stuff. And I talked to Warren, and he was, yeah, man, stick through it. I can do that stuff, but you stick through it. He was really proud of me, and that was great. But, man, honestly, the first 3 days or so were rough. But after that, I began to experience Christ, honestly, I have never experienced him before. And I've been walking, I would say, steadfastly with the Lord for several years now. But that was something that I had not experienced to that point. I actually prayed at the beginning of the semester, reading through a book. One of the things the guy talked about was a breath prayer. And it's just a prayer that you use to center yourself, to make your attention, focus back to Christ, to shift it back to Christ throughout the day. And it's supposed to be, it's called a breath prayer because it is a short prayer that you can say with a single breath. And so for me, I was like, you know what, I honestly, I don't know why. I don't remember what it was that made me think of this, but I was like, you know what? I think I want to know God and be known by him. or I want to know God and I want to treasure him. And for some reason, like that sat on me for literally like 2 months before we started this. And then God answered it, not in a way I was expecting, not necessarily in a fun way, but God answered it like I had never known Christ to that level. Only after all of the little things that cluttered up my life, after all of the distractions had been stripped away kind of forcefully, only then like was I able to experience God on that level, to experience that relationship in that level of intimacy. And it changed everything for me. And in that moment, like when I began to experience him at that level, like I understood, man, like Christ is worth video games. Like I wouldn't have said before that, like I would, if you had asked me, I never would have said like video games are better than Christ, like ever. But when you look at the time that I spent playing video games, man, I valued them more than Christ. But after that, I realized, no, like there's no comparison. Like this is so much better. Christ is worth everything else. And I think that when we realize exactly what a relationship with him is worth, that is when we will see that when we give everything else up, we actually aren't losing out. When we give up all of those little things, we're not missing out. We are gaining more than we could ever give away because knowing Christ is worth everything else. Which actually leads us to the next point for tonight, which is knowing costs. Knowing Christ will cost us. And if we look at verse 8, in the second half there, Paul says, I have suffered the loss of all things. So not only did he count those things as loss, but whenever he came to Christ, he actually had to give those things up. And I think that's something that we don't really understand here in Texas. Not that you haven't experienced loss, but many of us have not really had to experience great levels of loss in order to accept Christ. That's not something, we didn't have to give up any of our success, any of our, I think, accomplishments really to come to Christ, and for a lot of us anyways. Instead, I think that growing up at FBC Dumas, a small little Baptist church, what I saw around myself, and I think what we see around us, are a lot of Christians who they see their life as going to church. Like what being a Christian is going to church regularly. It's providing for their families, working hard, and it's trying not to sin too badly. But the cost of knowing Christ is not, this is a funny example, but it's not giving up the Harry Potter movies, which is something I was not allowed to watch growing up. Like that was something my parents were like, you're a Christian, you can't watch the Harry Potter movies. But it's more than that. It's so much deeper. The world portrays Christians a lot of times as being like Ned Flanders from The Simpsons. I don't know if y'all watch The Simpsons. Or I think his name is Kenneth from 30 Rock. That one might not, I don't know if that one lands as well, but Glenn from Superstore, which was one that I was watching before I gave up TV, and they're all caricatures. They're all cartoonish Christians who they care a whole lot about their morals. They're all kind of goofy. They're all nice. They're all very respectful, and they all, put an emphasis on not sinning, so much so that they call the other people around them not to sin, but they put this big emphasis on being a Christian and being known as being a Christian. But you don't really see those people make a cost. And I don't think the world sees us as having to make that cost. But being a Christian it's much deeper than that. And none of that stuff is bad, but there is actually a cost that comes with being a Christian. And I think it's one that we often forget about. In knowing Christ and in pursuing a relationship with him, we will in turn have to give up a lot of the things that we value, the things that this world tells us to value, things that keep us from putting Christ first. And I don't know exactly what that looks like for you, but for Paul, it meant giving up his whole life. Everything that he had built up to that point, everything that he had accomplished, he had to give all of that up for Christ. His career as a Pharisee, all of the friends, the progress that he made, the respect, the reputation, they were all gone. They were actually taken away from him. I don't know that he really had an option. If it was going to be him pursuing Christ, like those things were going to be taken away from him. And I think it's fair to say that most of us haven't experienced that same level of loss coming to Christ. But as I was writing this, I was thinking, is it really that we haven't had to? Is it really that we haven't been called to let go of stuff? Is it really that there hasn't been a cost all along? Or is it more been we haven't been willing to pay that cost? Because Christ is actually asking us. I think that he is asking us constantly, are you going to pick me or are you going to pick the things of this world? Do you want what I have to offer you, Or are you going to keep holding on to that thing that I'm trying to make you let go of? And when Christ asked me that question, I didn't want to pay that cost. I think that question first came up when I was in junior high, and I had to deal with a lot of people who were not Christians and who didn't live with Christians. I was actually homeschooled up to that point, so I didn't have to deal with people like that a whole lot. But when I did, I realized, no, like I want to fit in. I want to make friends. Like I think that's more important than anything else. And so I didn't want to pay that cost. And my relationship with him suffered. And when I got into college, I wasn't willing to give up my dreams of being an engineer and being successful. And when it came to relationships and comfort, I wanted to hold on to the sources of comfort that I found in pornography and in sleeping around. I chose those things over him because I thought that they were worth more. I thought that they would make me happier. I thought the pleasure that I could get from a screen or a one-night stand was worth more than what Jesus was offering me. Even as those things were hurting me, as miserable and as I was holding on to those things, they continued to hurt me. Like, guys, I want to be real honest with you. I was in a deep, deep pit during that time. I was depressed deeply, and it was the sins that I was living in that were making me that way, and I still wanted to hold on to them. Even when Christ was like, hey, I've got something better, I wanted to hold on to those things. And unfortunately, like, even after coming back, like I said, I would say that I've been steadfastly pursuing the Lord for years now. Even after coming back, there are still times when he asks me to let go of stuff, and I don't want to. And there are times when I actually try to bend over and pick up the things that he's already taken out of my hands. There in verse 8, Paul goes on to say that not only have I suffered the loss of all things, but he says, I consider them as dung. And the word there is actually skubalon in the Greek. And it can be translated as garbage, as dung, as rubbish. But the true meaning behind that is actually, it's very vulgar. It's a very vulgar word for poop. It's crap. Like, I mean, I'm not going to say the actual word, but it's a word that I'm not allowed to say on stage. Like, Paul is trying to draw a picture of what those things actually look like compared to Christ. And that's how we have to begin to view those things. When that choice is offered to us, are we going to say, Christ is worth everything? He is worth me letting go of everything in the world? Or are we going to hold on to that disgusting, nasty thing and pick it back up? That's a decision that I think we have to make. Real quickly, you don't have to turn there, but in Matthew 13, Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven, he says, is like treasure buried in a field that a man found and reburied. Then in his joy, he goes and sells everything he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. When he found one priceless pearl, he went and sold everything he had and bought it. This is how we are to see this relationship, as this priceless treasure that we are willing to give up everything else in order to gain. And I think that there are people in our life that we are willing to sacrifice stuff for. I think that we have family and friends, and hopefully in the future, I hope to have children that, man, like I would be willing to give up anything for them. And if it came down to it, I think that I'd be able to give up my life for those people. But we have to ask ourselves, you have to ask yourself, is Jesus one of those people? Like, would I actually give up stuff for Jesus? What exactly would you be willing to give up for Jesus? For me, like, I struggled to give up my time. Would you be willing to give up your dreams? What about, like, just your plans for the future? If God came to you and told you, man, like, I actually have something better for you, would you be willing to sacrifice that? What about the sin that you're holding on to? What if you have some of those sources of comfort that you hold to and cling to? Like, if Christ, and I think that he is, comes to you and says, I have something better, would you actually be willing to sacrifice those things for him? We know that those things, everything that he's asking us to give up is skubalon anyways. We know that it's worthless. So why do we still pick it up? Knowing Christ will cost us those things, but it's worth it. And if you aren't willing to give up everything for Christ, then I don't think that you actually do know him very well. And Jim Elliot would agree. Jim Elliot was a missionary who gave his life to take the gospel to an unreached people group in Ecuador. he spent years actually preparing for that mission. He spent years in other countries learning the dialect. There were people who knew the dialect, and so he spent this time working towards that goal. And when he got there 2 days after he made contact with this particular tribe, him and the other 4 missionaries that he was with were speared to death by those people. Jim Elliot actually had a gun on him at the time. And I read a couple of different accounts. Some people said that he didn't fire the gun at all, and some people said that he fired the gun into the air as a warning shot. But regardless, he refused to shoot those people in order to save his life. He was actually willing to let these people kill him because he didn't want to take away their chance at salvation. He wrote in a journal entry that he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose, stating that doing the work of Christ is worth even his life. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. 2 years after he was killed by those people, his wife actually took a mission trip with their, she was 10 months old, so 2-3 years old daughter, to that same tribe and saved those people. Many of those people came to know Christ because of that man's wife, including some of the people who were responsible for killing her husband. Man, I just want to say that man was a man who knew that knowing Christ cost, and he still made it the goal of his life. It was still the most important thing to him, which actually leads us into our final point for tonight, that knowing is the goal. So in verse 10, the very beginning there, back in Philippians, I didn't switch back over. But in verse 10, my goal is to know him. Now, Paul is somebody who I think that we would argue he knew Christ. Like, Paul is somebody who spent his life pursuing Christ and doing the work of Christ. He met Christ face to face on the road to Damascus. He planted churches for Christ. He shared the gospel with people. He wrote letters that we now use as scripture. He was in prison as he was writing this letter, and he eventually died for Christ. Like, Paul is somebody that we would say knew Christ. So why is it his goal to know Christ? I actually have a funny story that I think will shed some light on that. So I mentioned a name earlier, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is a girl who I met actually here at the Way, and we've been dating for about 3 years. About a year, well, and God willing, hopefully we will be married next spring. So amen for that. But a little over 6 months into our relationship, we had already gone through some hard times. I would say that I knew Elizabeth pretty well. We had gotten pretty close. But about 6 months in, there was a very particular circumstance or situation. One night we were at my house, and I was doing dishes. I think we had just finished eating, and I was scrubbing some of the dishes clean. And Elizabeth noticed on our fridge, we had one of those flip-up calendars, and it was attached to our fridge with a magnet, and it was currently on February. It was July. So we had not updated that calendar in like 5 months. I lived with 3 other roommates at the time. None of us, it didn't occur to any of us to update that calendar. But Elizabeth was sweet enough to update that for us. Like, she was just switching it. And I'm not very good at making jokes. I don't know if you've noticed that tonight, but I'm not. And I think that I'm funny. I will laugh at my jokes, but not everybody else does. So when Elizabeth started to switch that calendar, when she started to flip that page, I just kind of looked at her and I was like, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm updating the calendar for you. And instead of saying, thank you, like, that's sweet or anything like that, I said, why would you do that? February is my favorite month. Like, why would you do that? And she made a weird face, which normal people would. I laughed and went back to the dishes. I was like thinking, oh man, that was so funny. I did so good. So I finished the dishes and I turned back around and the calendar is actually back on February. And I'm wondering, now why did she do that? That's so weird. And so I went and asked her and I was just like, hey, like, are you trying to get back at me? Like, was that to, like, I don't know, are you being funny back? And she's like, no, that's your favorite month. Like, I wouldn't do that to you. And I'm like, I have no emotional attachment to February. I could care less. Like, it's not my birth month. There's nothing about February that I care about. And so we started to talk and realized that even though we thought we knew each other, I had been making a lot of jokes, including that morning. I made one that was pretty much the same thing, that we're not landing. We're not getting across at all. And my point with that is that, like, I thought I knew Elizabeth, but there were obviously, like, some stuff that we did not know about each other. And I know that I know Elizabeth so much better now than I did then. But man, like, there is so much more that is coming. Like, I know that in marriage, me and Elizabeth will know each other better than we did then. And I think that it's the same truth applies to Christ. That in that relationship, as we pursue him, man, we will know him better the longer that we pursue him. As with any relationship, it takes time to get to know someone. Icebreakers and stalking Facebook accounts really don't work. Experiencing life with a person and being with them in all sorts of interactions, like that is how you build relationships. That is how you get to know somebody. Time is required, and it is an ongoing process that will last your lifetime. If we look at the church as the bride of Christ, then everything up until the point that we are fully united with him, it's just preparation for an eternal marriage with him. And Paul recognized that. I think that was Paul's point in saying that that's my goal, that he, even though he knew Christ and he knew Christ at a deep level, he deeply valued that relationship, and he knew that there was more that he could go. He knew that there was more to know about Christ. And the good thing for me and the good thing for you is that you can start that process now. You can dive deeper now. If you haven't had that relationship before, you can start that relationship now. He is offering it to you. He wants to pull you in. He wants to get to know you. He wants to love you. He wants to show you that he loves you.